This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.
Soon, for the first time in our history, a Native woman's signature will be on our nation's currency.
That was Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking in September at the swearing-in of Chief of the Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba, as U.S. Treasurer. Chief Malerba is the first Native American to serve in this role. Today, Where We Live, Madam Treasurer Malerba joins us to describe her new position and goals, including how to improve federal communication and resources for local tribes. You can join us, too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. With us on Zoom now is U.S. Treasurer and Chief of the Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, Katatal Tamawish, thank you, Lucy. I'm so happy to be back on your show. It's always a pleasure.
And congratulations to you. This must be a momentous time in your long career when you think about where you have gone and how you've represented the Mohegan Tribe. I think the news broke in June of the appointments by President Biden, the swearing in September. How does it feel?
I am so honored to be part of this administration and to serve as the United States Treasurer, particularly because it is the first Indigenous person to ever serve in this role. So I really think, my appointment is a promise kept, by the Biden-Harris administration. They committed to having our Native voices heard at the highest levels of government. And I think that my appointment is proof of that.
I mentioned, and our listeners know, you are a lifetime chief of the Mohegan Tribe, and I understand you come from a long line of chiefs. You also made history when you became a chief in modern times, the first, I believe, woman chief of the Mohegan Tribe. And so, again, can you talk about this moment for you? And when you think about the family that you come from and what this means to the Mohegan people.
Well, obviously, you know that my great-grandfather was a chief during his time, and my mom served on tribal council for a long time. And I'm inspired by all the very strong female leaders that we've had in our tribe throughout time. I wish my mom was here to see this moment because she would be so proud. But I know that being in this role is really serving not only all of Indian country, but all of our Native nations, all of our Native citizens, but also all of the communities throughout the United States, because part of the role of treasurer is community engagement. And so I hope that I will make a difference for all of the people throughout this United States.
So let's talk more about these new roles. Again, U.S. Treasurer, but you're also overseer of a new Office of Tribal and Native Affairs at the Treasury Department. So can you tell our listeners more?
Yes. Well, as you know, I was on the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee for a long time. And one of the things that we've been advocating for in each agency and department throughout the federal government is to have an Office of Tribal Affairs and Native Affairs for the sole purpose of helping each agency understand not only what their trust and treaty obligations are for tribes, but also to ensure that policy serves our Native nations. And so I'm proud to stand up this office. We do have tribal people working in the Office of Recovery Programs right now, and they have really done a wonderful job helping, get all of the Treasury funds out to Native nations, but to do so in a way that is respectful of tribal sovereignty. And the way they've done that is through consultation to really talk with tribes about how best these programs can be designed to serve them, and also to understand what some of the challenges and barriers might be to deployment of these funds.
And when you talk about challenges and barriers, what do you mean?
Well, for instance, the tribes in Alaska don't always have good internet access. So if we're asking them to apply online or we're asking them to submit reports online, that may not work for them. And so we need to understand what some of those challenges may be and develop alternative pathways to make sure that they're successful also.
In a profile of the Associated Press, they describe this latter role, again, overseer of the new Office of Tribal and Native Affairs at the Treasury Department, as also thinking about new ways to help tribes develop their economies. So tell me more from that perspective.
Sure. Well, as you know, and I think we've chatted before, tribes do not tax their citizens. So the way that they provide services for their citizens is through economic development on their reservations. We need to make sure that as we think about economic development on reservations, that we're thinking about what some of the nuances might be, and also what some of the considerations might be for wherever tribes are located throughout the United States. And as you think about it, tribes are so very unique, even though, we have some very shared characteristics. You could think about the New England tribes as being Algonquin. You could think about the Great Plains tribes as being, similarly situated. We all have unique ways that we want to serve our people. And I think that that's what's most important. Some tribes will always receive their healthcare services, for instance, through Indian Health Services. Other tribes will say, no, we want to be self-governing, which means Indian Health Services will provide the funding that they normally would have spent for that tribe to the tribe, and then the tribe will uphold that trust and treaty obligation and design the programs in a way that is culturally sensitive for their people.
Again, you're hearing U.S. Treasurer and Chief of the Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba, here where we live, as we talk about her new roles within the federal government. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You've held many different roles, been part of many different boards related to tribal nations for some time. And the Day reported that you were also on the board of the United South and Eastern Tribes, which I believe is a nonprofit intertribal group, where you, quote, long lobbied for better communication between the nonprofit, intertribal group, and the federal government. So can you talk about how that will be part of your mission as U.S. Treasurer as well?
I was very fortunate to be on the board of United South and Eastern Tribes. They're a 501(c) and a 501(c)(4) organization, and it is comprised of 33 tribes that range from Maine down to Florida, over to Texas. And so it's a very diverse group of tribes. Again, when you think about the Northeast and the Southeast and say the tribes that are situated along the Gulf Coast, very different histories. And some of those tribes are the remnants of tribes that had to move to Oklahoma and who were displaced during the Trail of Tears. But there are some tribes that still remain in those southeastern states. So as a board member, one of the things that we would do would be to talk about good federal policy and to advocate for good federal policy and to weigh in on legislative efforts for all of the agencies throughout the federal government. And so as a member of USET, I was fortunate to be appointed to several advisory committees at the federal level, one being Treasury, but the other being National Institute of Health, the Indian Health Services Tribal Self-Governance Advisory Committee, the Department of Justice Tribal Nations Conference. So I was able to kind of look across multiple agencies to see how things work, and also to advocate for good federal policy on behalf of all the nations throughout this United States, not just the 33 tribes. Now that I'm here in this role, there's a bright line between my former board representation and what I'm doing here at Treasury. And so I'm no longer on the board and no longer am able to speak on their behalf, but surely we have very talented people on that board who have worked with that board for a long time. And Sarah Harris, who is our vice chairwoman, is now taking my place on that board. And I think that that's wonderful. She's a very strong tribal leader. She also has historic relations with the tribe. Her dad was the chairman when we received federal re-recognition and built Mohegan's Sun. And she's a younger voice. So I think that's good. It's time for these younger folks to step up.
So getting back to your role within the Treasury Department, thinking about how to get Treasury funds to the tribal nations, we talked about some of the challenges. But when we think about the pandemic and the pandemic relief funds, I understand the largest single infusion of federal funding to Indian country to date, that was reported in the Day. And so thinking about all those different agencies, Madam Treasurer Malerba, again, how you're going to work to better collaborate within these agencies to make sure that these funds are being used and getting to these nations appropriately.
Well, we're very fortunate because there is the White House Council on Native American Affairs. fondly known as WICNA. And Secretary Yellen does, as a principal for this department, does sit on that committee, and we staff her. And so we're able to see how different initiatives may actually be owned in part by various agencies. And so we're looking at ways to reduce some of the siloed impact of that and really think about how we can work across agencies to better serve Indian country. I also think that that's a way to think about how we serve all of our citizens of the United States, because we're so engaged in our own mission. I think sometimes we need to look beyond our mission and think about, how do we engage with those other agencies? So in this role, of course, I'm looking at the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Services, and Health and Human Services, I think primarily, to see how we can at least, combine our efforts to make sure that as we think about how we are dealing with this post-pandemic world, that we're helping to rebuild those tribal nations from those very serious impacts that we experienced. I don't know if you read the recent New York Times, but it talked about the fact that life expectancy for tribal people decreased by 7 years. I mean, we think it's a big deal if life expectancy decreases by a few months, but 7 years, that was the impact of the pandemic. We were hit very hard with this.
When we think about your work again with this office, I believe that the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation also announced in October the appointment of a tribal member, Gene Swift, to the U.S. Department of the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee. Can you tell us more? I think you touched on this committee before, but the announcement that Gene Swift will also be joining this and the work that will continue.
Oh, sure. And I'd love to take credit for appointing Jean, but I can't take any credit for that. I have much respect for her and consider her a friend. But Chairman Neal from the Ways and Means Committee selected her because Treasury gets to appoint 3 people, and then Congress and the Senate get to appoint a combined total of 4 people. She was appointed in recognition of her very good work as the CFO at Mashantucket, but also she is known to Treasury and IRS because she served on the IRS Advisory Committee, not as an Indigenous woman necessarily. Of course, she always brings that lens with her, but due to her talent and her financial background. So I'm thrilled to have her on the committee. I think she'll be a very strong voice. We've worked on various initiatives together, and I know how thoughtful she is as she provides comments and feedback in terms of policy and also how we might look at issues in a very in-depth manner.
You're hearing U.S. Treasurer and Chief of the Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba, here where we live. She was sworn into her new role as U.S. Treasurer back in September. Again, you can join us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Earlier you talked about the economic development within tribal nations, mentioning that tribes cannot offer tax incentives on their reservations. And so thinking about other ways to spur economic development. Can you tell us more?
Oh, sure. And what I said was that tribes do not tax their citizens, which is how most municipalities and states provide services to their citizens. So we don't tax our citizens. We would like to be able to offer tax incentives. And in some locations, tribes are able to do that. And I think that will be something that we're working on here at Treasury to look at, are there ways to provide tax credits? But that is not a fully formed thought yet. I've been in the position for about 2 months or 3 months now. And so I'm just starting to get my feet on the ground. But surely we're going to look at ways that we can provide access to capital for tribes and how we can help tribes develop the infrastructure that perhaps would allow them to be more successful with economic development. As I mentioned, broadband capability is spotty on some reservations, and surely you need to have good infrastructure in terms of broadband. You need to make sure that you have good just infrastructure in general, running water. Some tribes have difficulty with running water. Some tribes have difficulty providing electricity if they're in very remote locations. So it really will be more of a whole of government, I think, process and initiative to look at how we can look at all of the tribes throughout the United States, and then tailor our approaches to those tribes based on what we hear from them.
You must be getting lots of questions from people, not only within the people you encounter in Connecticut, but with all the work that you've done about this new role, as you've mentioned, that you've been in for 2 months as U.S. Treasurer. What are some of the questions you're hearing and, the understanding of how the department can help Americans?
Well, I've been very fortunate here in the department. We have multiple departments within Treasury, and I'm just starting to get to know them. But we do have a counselor for climate change. And so I think as we think about the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sure that there will be a lot of engagement with that department. And we are going to be holding a tribal consultation about the Inflation Reduction Act. So we are really going to be gathering good information from tribes to see how we might best serve them, and to think about, what policies we may need to think about, and how tribes can weigh in on regulations. There's a very formal process that happens when any department issues a notice of regulations. And so tribes will have an opportunity to weigh in on that. We will be reviewing their feedback and input, and hopefully be able to incorporate some of that into the final rulemaking process.
And as Treasurer, you also oversee U.S. Mint and the Treasurer's Office of Consumer Policy, as well as working with the Federal Reserve. So can you talk about those perspectives?
Well, I have to say I've learned so much about the Mint as well as the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. They are fascinating operations, and it's amazing, the volume of output that each of those different departments provide. So it's been a lot of fun looking at that and understanding a little bit about their process. It's their manufacturing processes, as well as, policy, making departments, because when you think about our currency, people need to have faith in our currency. And so I've been very fortunate to understand a little bit about that process, and how there is a lot of safety built into our currency, and the process that happens, and also how, the money gets made. That's been terrific. And I have to say, I'm super proud of the fact that this will be the first time that 2 women are on our currency, because Secretary Yellen is the first female Secretary of Treasury. And again, I'm the first Indigenous person to be the United States Treasurer, but not the first woman. So this is going to be historic.
Yeah, we heard that clip from Treasury Secretary Yellen at the top of the show about your name soon to be seen on U.S. currency. The Day reported likely by the end of the year, and there was a discussion about how your name would appear, either Chief Lynn Malerba or Chief Many Hearts, Mutawi Mutahash Lynn Malerba. Can you tell us about the meaning of your Mohegan name?
Well, I can't scoop PR on when the money is going to come off the presses, but I will tell you that I signed my name Lynn Roberge Malerba, and there's a very sentimental reason why I did that. There are no rules. I mean, there are prohibitions for signing any moniker. So whether it's Mr., Mrs., Doctor, or anything. So I thought, okay, that's fair. I guess I can't sign Chief, but for those of you who know me, I grew up in a family of 7 children with my parents, just the most loving, wonderful parents on the planet. However, they struggled financially because they had 7 children. And so they always had a little bit of difficulty making sure they had enough funds available to provide for us. We always had what we needed, but surely they were not wealthy people. And so my middle name is my parents' last name, Roberge. And so it was a very emotional moment for me to sign their name on the currency, knowing how they struggled to raise us, knowing what loving parents they were. So despite the fact that they had difficulties financially sometimes, now their name will be on the currency. And I think that that's a wonderful legacy to them.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us. When we look at the swearing-in ceremony that happened in September, you were there with your family. And I wonder if you can talk about that moment with us.
Well, it was very difficult to not be emotional at that moment. And it was very special to me that my family was able to witness such a wonderful moment. I had 2 of my sisters there, as well as my daughters, sons-in-law, grandchildren, and numerous members of our Council of Elders and Tribal Council there, and other tribal people here located in DC. So it was really very special to be in Chairman butler attended as well. We needed all of our Connecticut Indians in the house. But it was really a wonderful moment. And again, I wish my parents were there to see it. I know that part of any joy in my life is making my family proud, whether it's my immediate family or my tribal family, and in this case, all of Indian country proud, and Connecticut. So it was really a special moment, and Secretary Yellen was just so gracious in her remarks.
There's a picture of your family during that ceremony at ctpublic.org/where we live. Can you tell us about the ceremonial, the dress that you have on, and what that means for you and your family?
It was very important to me that we swore in an Indigenous woman, because that is my role. And it is something that has never been done before. So while I couldn't sign chief to the money, which was fine, I really did want people to recognize me as an Indigenous woman and an Indigenous leader. And I was thrilled that my daughters wore their regalia and my grandchildren wore their regalia, except for my grandson, because I didn't have time to make him a new ribbon shirt. But one of my granddaughters wore her mother's regalia, and that was very touching to me. And our Council of Elders also were dressed in their regalia. So it was really a celebration for all of us.
We're speaking to you, and it happens to be National Native American Heritage Month. For listeners, what do you want them to reflect on this November?
What I'd like people to remember is it's not just about our history. It's about the fact that we are very resilient people, and we're still here, and we're still contributing to the overall good of the United States with our culture, with our history, with the art that we make, with our Indigenous foods. So the lands that we all love, we all share together. And it's important that people remember that we may be the first people here and we were the stewards of this land, but now I want everybody to remember that they need to be good stewards of our homelands as well.
Again, you've been hearing U.S. Treasurer and Chief of the Mohegan Tribe, Lynn Malerba. Madam Treasurer Malerba, I want to thank you for the many times you've come on our show to talk about issues that matter to Native American tribes, including the Mohegans. The one that really stands out to me is when you came on to talk about Flying Bird Fidelia Fielding, the last fluent speaker of the Mohegan language. Her diaries and papers returned to the Connecticut tribe from Cornell University. I remember that being a powerful hour. Thank you so much for the time that you've taken to educate our listeners.
Oh, Lucy, it is always my pleasure. So I would say Wikotamui. I'm learning the language. I'm not quite there yet. But Wikotamui means it is my pleasure. And so I wish you all the best. And thank you for having me on your show today.
Thank you. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. Coming up after the break, we're going to hear from CT Humanities Executive Director Jason Mancini. He's examined census records that reveal the historical erasure of New England's vibrant Native American population. We're going to learn more after the break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As I mentioned, November is National Native American Heritage Month, and my next guest has done extensive research on the region's tribes. Dr. Jason Mancini is Executive Director of CT Humanities. He's the former leader of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. He's also an anthropologist who has examined census records that reveal the historical erasure of New England's vibrant Native American population. He joins us now on Zoom. Jason, welcome back to the show.
Lucy, good morning. It's delightful to be here.
This note, CT Humanities is an underwriter of Connecticut Public. Our listeners can join our conversation at 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before we hear more about your research, Jason, I'm wondering if you can comment on what Madam Treasurer, what Lynn Malerba, who's the longtime Mohegan chief, shared with us about transparency, communication, even more resources between the federal government and local tribes.
Well, it's just incredibly exciting to have somebody of her knowledge and experience in this role, especially having sort of seen the history of the tribes and their dispossession and historical erasure from the region's landscape, where they were the stewards, as she pointed out, of this land. These were their resources, and it fell out of their possession very rapidly. So to be able to see tribes empowered in this way is such a sea change, and to see the opportunity that tribes now have at their hands is just very exciting.
And we should mention, again, history also being made when we think about Secretary Holland leading the Interior Department. Jason, your thoughts on that?
I think this is all wonderful news for Indian country. To have these perspectives, to have this women sort of connecting indigenous communities to these homelands, and steward them in the ways that really haven't had this connection in so long from anybody in the past.
I know that you're a lifelong Connecticut resident, and so tell me how you got interested in the history of tribes in this region.
Well, a long time ago, my uncle got me interested. He is an archaeologist and anthropologist, and he was working with the Mashantucket Pequot tribe. We both happened to live in Ledyard at the time, and he was doing archaeological research on his doctoral dissertation, and I was just very interested, and always wanted to be outside and exploring and learning. And so I used to beg my parents to let me go with him in the field. And he usually took me and occasionally dumped me off in UConn's archaeology lab to scrub artifacts. And I just couldn't get enough of it. So I continued to do it. And as I got older, I went to school with Pequots, and started working on the reservation doing archaeological work as a teenager, and just continued to do it. I studied it in college, in more specifically history, and then the Pequot Museum project began in the early '90s, and I got drawn into that, and continued to do all of this work collaboratively with the tribal communities in the region.
And as I mentioned, you're the former leader of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, a wonderful, wonderful resource for our state and for those who are coming into our state. So let's talk more about your research, Jason. When we think about the historical record and erasing Native people who lived here, how did you start to do that research, and what did you find?
Yeah, so about 20 years ago or so, I started doing my work in the tribe's research department, and I moved away from archaeology and started looking at the tribal communities and begin to understand why are these persisting narratives of Indian disappearance. They've been going on for centuries. How do we begin to explain that? And I wasn't comfortable with the scholarly explanations of what this looked like, whether it was just working on farms or in the military, or religious migrations and things like that. So I started looking at historical documents around the presence and absence of Native people on reservations. And there seemed to be a lot of gaps. But this disappearance narrative really was puzzling for a while. So I started looking at how, in fact, Indians were being counted. And I'm using the term Indian very deliberately because it is an important legal and political term, and embedded in the Constitution, and so on. So I really started looking at who is counting, why are they counting, and how thorough are these enumerations. So looking at the earliest counts in the early 1700s, it was often tied to tribes' size and power, often tied to the number of fighting men, as they were called. And then their populations were extrapolated by a factor of a multiplier of 4 or 5 that would include women and children. And that's how European colonists could understand how powerful tribes were and what they might be up against, having just been through King Philip's War in the 1670s and earlier than that, the Pequot War. As we move into the mid-18th century, the 1740s and 50s, the New England town begins to settle and develop around these parishes, and road systems start to develop, and clerks are beginning to count people a little bit differently. But there are requirements by the English crown to enumerate all white people, white people, Indian people, and Black people. And so they start these systematic counts, town by town, and you can start to see these enumerations evolve. And just for a little bit of perspective, the landscape, I want to step back from the enumerations for a second. The landscape in southern New England is such that there are about 9 million acres of land. And by the American Revolution, all of that land, which was Indian country, evaporated out of Indian possession, and the tribes were left collectively with about 30,000 acres of land. So my goal was to sort of understand, how are Indians being counted? And there are particular tribes in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And they're being documented in other ways. But in the first census of 1756 that does this town-by-town census in Connecticut, only 3 tribes are counted: the 2 Pequot tribes and Mohegan, Niantic. And we know that there's a Mohegan tribe. We know there's a Wangunk and a Tungus and a Quinnipiac and a Pagusset and a Schaghticoke tribe, but they're not being counted. And then by 1762, suddenly 8 tribes are being enumerated, and the population is increased from 617 to 940. And that piqued my interest. And that documentation around reservations and counting became clear that as the towns were forming, Indians were being counted more completely. And then the aftermath, this is, so just for your listeners, this is during and in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War. And many of the tribal communities are fighting on behalf of the English, and the men are being disproportionately impacted, and many of them are never coming home by mortality in the encampments or death in battles. And so the impact of that is that many women and children are falling on hard times. They're having a hard time providing for themselves. They no longer have access to their traditional resources, the land that they used to harvest resources from. And in doing so, many were forced into indentured servitude, working on English farms, and in a situation not unlike enslavement. And so by the year or two before the American Revolution, in the 1774 census, we all of a sudden see a much larger Indian population scattered across 49 Connecticut towns. And so that 940 becomes nearly 1,400. And this isn't just birth rates. This is better documentation. And this is just for Connecticut. Rhode Island and Massachusetts are experiencing similar representation and much larger numbers. And then something interesting happens. Once the American Revolution is concluded, the early republic begins to document Indians in a different way, whether they're lumping them in with a broader population of color and just calling everybody Black, or creating new categories like mulatto, and splitting out Indian people from that category. And what is really most vexing is that by 1790, with the first federal census, there are exactly 0 Indians enumerated. So the federal census takes all the Indian population and excludes them completely. And they do that through 1870 or through 1860. And in 1870, the first federal census to include Indian people in places like New London, where there were hundreds of them in the prior years, has only 2 Indians being enumerated.
Wow. I wanted to remind our listeners that they're hearing Jason Mancini, Executive Director of CT Humanities, as we talk about your research revealing the historical erasure of a New England's vibrant Native American population. So you're talking about the different ways that Indians were counted or not counted in the census. You were also drawing on other research, including from Ezra Stiles. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, Ezra Stiles was an interesting character. He was a minister and later the president of Yale University or Yale College. And he had an obsessive interest in counting Indians and did so across the region. And one of the interesting things, and his counts were happening in the early 1760s, and he started up in Mohegan homelands in Western Massachusetts, and then started documenting the tribal communities in Connecticut and along coastal southern New England, including the Narragansett and the Wampanoags of Eastern Massachusetts. And he was very detailed. He provided specific families by name, the number of children, boys and girls, whether they lived in a framed house like a European or in a wigwam or wetu, which is a traditional native home, and the number of people. And he did that at a particular time when Native communities were losing land very rapidly, being dispossessed by neighboring white farmers. So there was a lot of factionalism within tribal communities, and that was being leveraged by the colonies. And the colonies ended up, and Ezra Stiles was a perfect example of this, only enumerating a portion of the tribal communities. So, for example, at Mohegan, where Chief Malerba's homelands are, there were 2 major Mohegan villages, Ben Uncas and John Uncas, his brother, and only one of the communities was being counted by Stiles, Benstown. Johnstown was completely eliminated from these enumerations. So it makes it appear that the Native people, there's far less Native people. Similarly, among the Narragansett and Niantic of Rhode Island, this community was in the midst of a heartbreaking series of land losses when the tribal sachem, Tom Ninigret, was selling land, thousands of acres of land, to feed his expensive and lavish lifestyle at the expense of the tribal community. So these tribal factions formed around what were called a sachem's party and a tribes party. And only one portion of the Narragansett tribal community was being counted because of this. Similarly, at Mashantucket, an entire portion of their reservation was sold out of their possession in 1762. And Stiles only counted roughly half of the tribe, leaving 20 families, at least 20 families off of his enumeration. So this really, in sum, leaves the public, the authorities, with the understanding that there are far fewer Indians than there actually are on the landscape, and this persists over time. And I think what this really does broadly is build this sort of narrative in this young country that Indians are simply not present. And there are other things that begin to complicate that. In the absence of land, Native people are in fact at war. They are on farms, but increasingly, many Native people are going to sea, and they're not being seen there. They're only being documented by customs officials. So when tribal overseers, which are basically white white caregivers and managers of tribal affairs in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they're going to the reservations and saying the only people on the reservations are old women, crippled men, and children. All of the able and smart men are gone, or all the smart men are off at sea. So we lose this sense of who's here, and this accumulates over the course of the 19th century, so that people like James Fenimore Cooper can write something like The Last of the Mohicans in 1826 that really amplify this myth of disappearance.
Yeah, that's all really important context. Thank you for filling that in for us. You're hearing Jason Mancini, Executive Director of CT Humanities. We'll continue talking with him after the break. And if you have questions about his research and the history of tribes in this region, you can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest is Jason Mancini, Executive Director of CT Humanities. He's also co-founder of the Akamout Educational Initiative, which works with educators in K-12 schools, institutions of higher learning, and public history sites to create awareness and informed dialogue about American Indian history, contemporary Native lifeways, and Indigenous futures. Jason, you're also, I understand, working with the Reimagining New England Histories Fellowship at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And as part of your recent appointment as visiting associate professor of slavery and justice. So can you tell us a little bit about this, how the focus is not just on Native American, but also African and African American experiences and voices?
Sure. Yeah, it's such an exciting initiative that draws together contemporary scholarship and communities to focus on really bringing about a new New England history, one that hasn't been heard, partly because many of the stories have been buried in archives, or simply we haven't listened to the source people, the communities themselves. And so this is a great opportunity to really bring to bear new voices that share these stories as broadly as possible. And this is a wonderful Mellon Foundation funded project in collaboration between Brown University, Williams College, and Mystic Seaport. So my involvement in this is really through my intersection of historical and archival research and community-based scholarship. And so I think it's a really exciting opportunity to look at through these intersecting communities historically and the challenges of documenting what's happened and transpired since the 18th and 19th centuries.
We just have about 4 minutes or so, but can you tell us a little bit about how the histories of African Americans are inextricably linked to that of Native Americans?
Sure. Well, in the mid 18th century, enslaved peoples were being brought to New England shores, and Native people and people of African ancestry were in the same spaces, and they interacted socially and sexually. And so their histories became entwined from that point. And their children of mixed ancestry were being counted in different ways. And by European authorities, it was often reduced to what people might call the one-drop rule, where any Black ancestry, the person was considered Black. But within Native communities, and importantly, the child follows the mother. Women's role and rights are foundational to tribal communities here. So this mixing was received differently within Native citizenship frameworks.
I mentioned this initiative where we also spoke to co-founders and Donna Spears and Chris Newell last year about the new Native American Studies requirement for Connecticut schools, Jason. Resources are being prepared in time, I believe, for the 2023 school year. Can you give us any updates on the work that you've all been doing?
Yeah, we've been working closely with the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies and the Connecticut State Department of Education to begin building the frameworks and structuring the curriculum. So this is a great opportunity, much the same as Chief's work at Treasury. We have Native people at the table in these initiatives. So they're driving the process, and their stories are being told in the way that they want them told. So our traditional linear view of history is being replaced with a sensibility around identity, kinship, community, and a sense of place and connection to homeland. And that's the kind of thing that we want to see being imbued within our curricular initiatives in Connecticut, especially when we're considering whose homelands in which we live.
Right. And we think about helping educators teach local Native history using those Native source resources that you mentioned, Jason. That's really important.
It is. Not just the tribal educators that are here, but the important sites like the Tantaquidgeon Museum at Mohegan and the Mashantucket Pequot Museum on the Pequot Reservation. These are incredibly valuable resources for people to visit, learn, listen. One of my earliest experiences as a child was visiting the Tantaquidgeon Museum and learning from Chief Harold Tantaquidgeon and Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who are amazing knowledge keepers. And you can see the impact it has on the contemporary tribal communities and how it's impacted Chief herself.
Well, it's been a pleasure to hear from you, Jason Mancini, Executive Director of CT Humanities, about your research. History has been a long focus on this show, and we thank you for the time you've given us.
You're very welcome, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Special thanks again to our tech director, Kat Pastor. Tomorrow is actually my last day hosting Where We Live. It's been quite a ride over the last 7 years. We're going to bring back some voices and talk about some of the shows that were really important to me as host as I take on a new role at Connecticut Public. We hope you join us.